So here's my run, which we'll analyze later. But really, like, it's all there. You go into the Analyze tab and you've got all your averages, you've got all of your peaks, and you've got all of the graphs. So whenever we're kind of referencing something, it's all going to be housed within this Analyze tab within the file. And that's where you're going to get your super simple data, which is pretty much your right-hand side, your peaks and your averages. And then on the left-hand side is where you can start to do a bit more of your deep dive and use the two to get into, the nitty gritty.
Okay, so we showed this graph before, and by the time I've gotten to this point where I'm eyeballing the data, I've already determined that the ride was probably too long, too hard, too variable, and we need to look at it a little bit closer. So what I did is I highlighted a section with a 1 hour criterium race within a 5 hour ride, and we're looking at it a little bit closer.
All right, so what have we got here? Because this blue line I know isn't part of Training Peaks.
No, so I added that blue line because pacing is probably one of my favorite things to look at, right? So we know that anytime we're above FTP, we have really limited time to stay there. So what I did is I drew this line here across where the athlete's FTP is, and then I wanted to understand why they went so slow towards the end of the race. And it's because they pretty much blew up, right? So early on in the race, it was pretty easy. Then there was a pretty big surge and a lull after that, and then some time too far above FTP. So the race dynamics, you don't really see that. This wasn't a Zwift race where it's an all-out time trial and you're just kind of pushing until you can't push anymore. This was an actual race. So there's the slowing and speeding is due to what everyone else was doing. So we can't just take the data for what it is and say that the athlete needs to work on X because of Y. We can look at the data to understand what was happening in the race. So what I see here is that there was time spent above FTP and then time spent too far below FTP. So that means this athlete wasn't able to bridge any gaps, make any breakaways, or just the race wouldn't let that happen either. So I see this lull in the middle and I'm trying to understand what happens. And fortunately for this athlete, the race was kind of saved because that last about 5 minutes was really hard and really high above FTP, and that looks pretty good. But as far as pacing goes, it's not a great pacing effort because we know that in the criterium, you want to save all your energy for the end. So if this athlete could have potentially saved some of that energy early on, it could have been a better finish in this race. So that's where I'm looking at pacing.
Yeah, that's right. That's where I think, like, I can look at this, you see the speed increase as well, and knowing how criteriums generally play out, I haven't seen, I can see that there's a comment there's some peak power notifications, and it's like, yeah, maybe like they've gone aggressive in the early stages and paid the price. And that's more of a deep dive in something we can highlight those sections, look at them, and get a better indication of what's happening within the race. Or like hopefully the athlete comments, but as we know, they don't always comment. Yeah. That's just how the race played out, and he did a massive kick right at the end and surged in for a good finish. But that's one way, yeah, definitely great way to look at it.
I also do the same thing with a mountain bike race, and I'll pretty much with my eyeball, I'll just be drawing across an FTP line, just understand better how much time was spent above the threshold. So I can do that now for you, and there it is. So this is just a classic mountain bike race with lots of time spent above FTP and lots of time spent doing nothing except coasting down a hill. But as we'll talk about, there's a lot of work going on still when we're coasting down a hill. But this is how I start to analyze. So I have that visual line with my eyeball to see how much time was spent over FTP. So after that, what I'm looking at is I'm looking at heart rate. So how did heart rate line up with these power efforts? So I can see early on, the effort was pretty high and the heart rate went really high. And that's exactly what we'd expect to see, as we talked about in the last module. So an increase in power output requires more oxygen. The heart has to beat faster to provide more oxygen, and that's why we see those line up. Then what we see as we get to the top of this uphill, for some reason power was down. So maybe it was some sort of a technical climb. But what I can see is at the second lap, it's actually doing a similar thing where the power here is below FTP, and here it's also below FTP. So what we can see is across laps, there's no major differences that we need to be thinking about. But I'm looking at heart rate then on the descent, and power is really low and heart rate drops in the first lap, which is really good, and that's exactly what we want to see. As we go across this race, this one was actually really well paced because heart rate is going up and coming down pretty predictably. And actually, as they're going down the descent, there's actually less pedaling cross laps, which is really good to see when we're looking at this kind of thing because there's less effort, right? And that's really good here because we can see that the heart rate is reducing even further, which means that we're recovering better. And then you can see here later on that this power output here on this climb is actually better than the last lap. So it's higher than FTP, which is another really good sign. And that shows that pacing is getting better across the laps. And the athlete hasn't blown all their matches in the first lap. So that's a deep dive of a mountain bike race.
Dr. Matt and I started the Performance Advantage podcast to help runners, riders, and outdoor competitors integrate sports science more effectively into their training and racing.
So over the last few years, Dr. Will and I have covered topics like the lactate threshold, training zones, power meters, and fatigue. Now we're condensing these popular and misunderstood topics into practical courses.
Our courses take our same podcasting style approach to learning and education, and we break it down into bite-sized chunks that you can digest either all at once or as practical little resources to use as and when you need them.
So the biggest difference between our course and any other course you might have taken is that we don't lecture you. It's a conversation between Will and I, and we're explaining complex sports science principles in an easy to understand manner.
Yeah, we also integrate how we use them on the regular. Our courses come with a certificate of completion as well as a lot of takeaway resources such as training plans, scientific articles, and quizzes that you can do to check your progress along the way.
Our sports science courses are available now. Register on performanceadvantagepodcast.com for immediate access.